They called him the Lionheart, a name that thundered across Europe, whispered by knights and feared by kings. To his followers, he was God's chosen warrior, a sword in the hand of heaven. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of Christian wrath, a storm in human form. But behind the legend was a man torn between glory and greed, between the light of faith and the shadow of pride. This is not the story of a saint, but of a king who fought for God and died for gold. In the summer of 1189, England was a land restless with change. King Henry II lay dying, betrayed by his sons and exhausted by decades of war. Standing beside his deathbed was his eldest surviving son, Richard, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of fire and a gaze that could silence a room. When the crown passed to him, the people rejoiced. They had heard tales of his courage, his victories in Aquitaine, his defiance against tyranny. They believed that England had found a hero, but England would soon learn that its new king was not made for peace. Richard loved war more than rule, and song more than speech. He barely spoke the language of his own people, preferring the soft romance of French. The throne of England was, to him, not a destiny, but a tool, a treasury to be emptied, a kingdom to be sold for a dream that had burned in his heart since childhood: Jerusalem. When Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City, Richard's soul ignited. He swore to wear the cross and lead the armies of Christ across the sea. To fund his holy war, he began selling everything he could: lands, castles, offices, even the rights to royal justice. "I would sell London itself," he declared, "if only I could find a buyer." The church praised his zeal. The people groaned under his taxes, but the king did not waver. He believed that God himself had placed this mission before him, and that glory waited beyond the horizon. Yet even before he set foot on the ships bound for the east, the world began to see another side of the Lionheart. He was brave, yes, but also ruthless. He was charming, yet cold. He could write songs of love in the language of poets, and in the next breath order the execution of his prisoners. His faith burned bright, but it cast long shadows. While Richard prepared for the crusade, England began to crumble in his absence. His brother John, hungry for power, watched from the shadows. The barons whispered, the treasury bled dry, and the people wondered what kind of king would leave his crown for a cross. But Richard's gaze was fixed eastward, toward the lands of desert and prophecy, where the walls of Jerusalem gleamed like a promise, and the armies of Saladin waited like a test from God. When he finally set sail, banners of red and white fluttered above his fleet, sunlight dancing on the sea like divine fire. The world held its breath, for a new Crusader king had risen. Yet as the waves carried him toward destiny, they also carried him toward ruin. For in the Holy Land, Richard would meet his greatest rival, his truest reflection, and the beginning of his end. The year is 1191. The Mediterranean burns beneath the Crusader sun as the greatest army of Christendom lands on the shores of the Holy Land. Among the banners of France, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, one standard shines brighter than the rest: a golden lion on a field of blood-red silk. Its bearer, King Richard of England, steps ashore with armor gleaming like fire, a sword at his side named for faith itself, Ascalon. To many, he is God's chosen champion. To others, an arrogant foreigner who thinks himself the hand of heaven. But all agree on one thing: the Lionheart has arrived. Richard wastes no time. The Crusader forces are fractured, exhausted by years of defeat and distrust. The once great army of the cross has become a collection of quarrelsome kings. Philip of France sulks in jealousy, German lords demand gold, and the Knights Templar fight among themselves. But where others see chaos, Richard sees opportunity. With his booming voice and fearless presence, he forges order from disorder. Soldiers follow him not just out of loyalty, but out of awe. On the battlefield, he is a force of nature, leading from the front, his sword flashing like lightning through the dust. Soon, his reputation spreads. From the coastal city of Acre to the heart of the desert, the name Richard the Lionheart strikes both terror and respect. When the Muslims hear it, they whisper it alongside another: Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a man as noble as he is powerful. Unlike many kings of the West, Saladin is not a brute. He is wise, disciplined, and merciful, the kind of leader even his enemies can admire. And so begins one of history's most remarkable rivalries, not just of armies, but of souls. Two men, born worlds apart, both believing they fight for God's truth. When they first clash outside Acre, The desert shakes with thunder. Richard, feverish with illness, is carried on a litter into battle, commanding from the front lines. Arrows fall like rain. Horses scream. Banners burn. Yet the Lionheart refuses to retreat. His courage becomes legend that day. Saladin, hearing of his enemy's valor, is said to have smiled and whispered, "Indeed, he is a king." But for all his heroism, Richard's faith begins to blur with fury. After the capture of Acre, thousands of Muslim prisoners stand at his mercy, hostages to be exchanged for Christian captives. When Saladin's emissaries delay the ransom, Richard's patience snaps. He orders every prisoner, more than 2,700 souls, executed outside the city walls. The ground turns red beneath the cross. His soldiers cheer. His priests fall silent. In that moment, the Lionheart earns victory, but loses a part of his soul. Still, the war continues. For months, Richard and Saladin test each other in battle and diplomacy. Warriors bound by mutual respect and divided by faith. Letters pass between them, filled with honor and admiration, yet neither man bends. Jerusalem remains a dream, just out of reach, shimmering beyond the horizon like a divine mirage. As the desert winds howl across the dunes, Richard begins to see that this war is no longer about Christ or salvation. It is about power, pride, and legacy. Two kings, mirror images, chasing the same illusion of eternity. The sun blazes over Palestine, merciless and blinding. For months, the armies of Christ and Islam have clashed and bled, their banners torn by sand and wind. The crusade that began as a holy mission has become a war of attrition, a test not only of strength, but of spirit. And at its center stands Richard the Lionheart, caught between two wars, one on the battlefield and one within his soul. By 1192, Richard's crusade has ground to a halt. He has captured the cities of Acre and Jaffa, but Jerusalem, the heart of his dream, remains untaken. His army, once glorious, is now weary and diseased. Food is scarce, water scarcer. The desert itself seems to conspire against him. Yet Richard refuses to turn back. He paces beneath the burning sky, staring toward the distant hills that hide the holy city. The air shimmers like a mirage, and in that haze, his faith begins to waver. Each night, as the fires die and his soldiers sleep, Richard walks alone through the tents. The silence is heavy, broken only by the cries of the wounded. He has begun to wonder if God is still with him. He prays, but heaven answers with silence. "If I fight for you," he whispers to the stars, "why does your city stay beyond my reach?" And in the distance, Saladin waits, calm, patient, watching. Unlike the reckless kings of the West, Saladin fights with time as his ally. He knows that the desert will defeat what his armies cannot. Yet even he begins to respect this stubborn English king who refuses to kneel. He sends gifts, fruit, horses, even ice from Lebanon to cool Richard's fever. Their rivalry turns into something stranger, a bond born of admiration. But admiration cannot win wars. The Crusader army begins to fracture. The French nobles grumble. The Templars argue with the Hospitallers. Disease spreads through the camps. And with every passing day, Richard's dream of Jerusalem fades like dust in the wind. His generals plead for retreat. Even his priests speak of compromise. But Richard, proud, unbending, and furious, cannot accept defeat. Then, one morning, he rides to a hilltop near Ramlah. From there, he can see the faint golden shimmer of Jerusalem in the distance. He dismounts, kneels in the sand, and removes his helmet. His eyes glisten in the heat. The city he has fought for years to reclaim stands right before him, yet he cannot enter. His men are too weak, his supplies too low. To march now would mean annihilation. In that moment, Richard the Lionheart, the man who would sell London for the cross, bows his head and weeps. He has fought for God, but found only exhaustion. He has chased glory, but met the limits of flesh and will. For the first time in his life, the Lionheart feels powerless. Days later, he meets with Saladin's brother to negotiate peace. There is no victory parade, no crown of thorns, no holy triumph. Instead, there is compromise. The Christians are granted access to Jerusalem's holy sites. The war ends, not in conquest, but in uneasy respect. As Richard sails from the Holy Land, the desert fades behind him, but the questions remain. What had he truly fought for? Faith or fame? God's will or his own reflection? In the shimmering mirage of the crusade, the Lionheart has glimpsed his truest enemy. It was never Saladin, it was himself. The sea stretched endless and cold as Richard's fleet left the burning horizon of the Holy Land behind. The war was over, not won, not lost, merely ended. He had stood against Saladin and lived. He had fought for God and earned the world's admiration. Yet as the coast of Palestine disappeared beneath the mist, the Lionheart felt no triumph, only the hollow silence that comes after a storm. The crusade had taken 3 years of his reign, countless lives, and nearly every coin in his treasury. England was broke, her people burdened by taxes, her lands restless. And while Richard fought in the name of heaven, his brother John had been busy in the name of ambition. Letters from home spoke of treachery, whispers of stolen power, alliances with France, and a kingdom on the edge of revolt. Richard knew he had to return, but the path home would become the most dangerous journey of his life. Storms wrecked his fleet, scattering ships like leaves across the Adriatic. Stranded and disguised as a pilgrim, the most famous man in Europe now travelled alone, his crown traded for a hood, his sword hidden under rags. The Lionheart had become the hunted. Winter, 1192, Austria. Snow fell quietly over the dark forests near Vienna. Richard, weary and ill, sought shelter in a small inn. But the world he once ruled by fear now ruled him with suspicion. One careless purchase, a fine ring too noble for a peasant, gave him away. Soon, armed men surrounded the building. Their leader was Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had insulted at Acre, tearing down his banner from the city walls and casting it into the dust. Now, the insulted Duke saw his chance for revenge. Richard the Lionheart, the conqueror of kings, was seized like a common thief. Chained and hooded, he was taken north through frozen valleys. A prisoner not of Saladin, but of Europe itself. From Austria, he was delivered to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who saw in him not a hero, but a golden prize. When the news reached England, it struck like thunder. The king who had fought for Christ was now a hostage of men who claimed to serve the same God. The emperor demanded a ransom, 150,000 marks of silver, a sum so vast it nearly equaled England's entire annual income. To free their king, the English people were taxed until their pockets bled. Priests stripped gold from church altars. Nobles melted family heirlooms. Even peasants sold their tools, believing that freeing Richard would free them from misfortune. Meanwhile, in his cold cell, Richard waited. He sang songs to keep his spirit alive. Songs of home, of war, of faith betrayed by greed. He who had once commanded armies now had nothing but his voice. A lion's roar echoing through stone walls. Months passed. The ransom was paid, and in 1194 the Lionheart walked free. The crowds that once hailed his courage now saw a thinner, greyer man, his eyes sharper, colder. The king, who left England for God, returned to find that the world was ruled not by faith, but by gold. Richard had seen the truth of men, that even the most sacred vows could be bought and sold. Yet he was not done. The fire still burned within him. He had lost Jerusalem, lost his fortune, lost his faith in men, but not his pride. And pride would soon lead him to his final war. When Richard the Lionheart finally set foot on English soil in March 1194, the cheers of his people rang through the air like the bells of salvation. For years they had prayed, paid, and suffered to bring their king home. Now he returned, scarred, hardened, his golden hair touched with grey, but his eyes still burning with the fire of a man who had seen both heaven and hell. Yet behind those cheers, a darker storm was brewing. While Richard had been fighting for God, his younger brother John had been fighting for the crown. In the king's absence, John had struck deals with France, seized castles, and tried to claim the throne for himself. He spread lies, whispering that Richard had died in captivity, that England needed a new ruler. Now face to face with the brother he had betrayed, John trembled. But Richard was no fool. He could have executed John and ended the threat. Instead, he smiled. That cold, calculated smile that only kings wear. "You are my brother," he said, "and I forgive you. But remember, I'm your king. Forgiveness, yes. Forgetfulness, never." With England restored to his hand, Richard turned his fury toward France and toward the man who had aided John's treachery, King Philip II. Once his ally on crusade, Philip had turned into his greatest rival. The Lionheart's eyes fixed once more across the channel. "Let us see," he growled, "if the Frenchman dares to face the lion on his own ground." War ignited again. Richard poured what remained of England's silver into rebuilding his armies. Castles rose like iron fangs along the border of Normandy. His greatest creation was Château Gaillard, the saucy castle, a masterpiece of medieval engineering perched high above the River Seine. To Richard, it was more than stone and mortar. It was defiance made solid, his roar carved into the land of France. For 5 relentless years, the Lionheart fought Philip across the fields of Normandy and Aquitaine. He led from the front as always, clad in shining mail, his war cry echoing through the chaos. Even his enemies admitted that he fought like no other. Reckless, brilliant, unstoppable. Chroniclers wrote that he seemed born of a race of giants, but behind every victory, England paid the price. Taxes rose again, the treasury emptied once more. The king who had been ransomed with silver now demanded even more of it to fuel his vengeance. And so the cycle repeated. Glory and ruin, faith and greed, power and debt. Richard's reign became a paradox. The king who conquered hearts on the battlefield, yet drained his own kingdom dry. But he could not stop. He was addicted to war, to the sound of swords, the smell of victory, the fleeting taste of immortality. By 1198, Richard had reclaimed nearly all his lost lands. France trembled again beneath his armies, yet the Lionheart's victories brought him no peace. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, begged him to rest, to think of legacy and not revenge. But Richard only laughed. "As long as I live," he said, "the King of France shall never know peace." It was a prophecy spoken in pride, and one that would soon come true, though not in the way he imagined. For destiny was already waiting for him, not on the battlefield, but in a quiet French village where gold gleamed in the earth, and death waited in silence. March 1199. The air over Limousin is heavy with spring rain and the smell of war. Richard the Lionheart rides through the forests of central France, not as a crusader, not as a conqueror, but as a hunter, hunting rumors of treasure. A local lord, Aymar of Limoges, has defied him, claiming to have discovered a hoard of gold buried beneath the earth. Gold that, by right, should belong to the king. For years, Richard had fought for faith, for glory, for pride. But now, he fights for something simpler. Money. The endless wars against France had drained his coffers. The ransom that bought his freedom still bled his people dry. And so the great Lionheart, once the champion of Christendom, now marched to besiege a small, half-forgotten castle, Châlus, all for a handful of gold coins glittering in the dirt. The siege was small by his standards, almost beneath him. The defenders numbered only a few dozen men, but Richard would not leave it be. He set up camp and ordered his siege engines into place. As the first stones crashed against the walls, the king himself, restless and reckless as ever, walked the field without armor, inspecting the enemy's defenses. His men begged him to step back. He laughed, the same fearless, foolish laugh that had carried him through 100 battles. Then, from the ramparts, a lone defender, perhaps a boy no older than 20, raised a crossbow. He aimed at the golden-haired king standing proud beneath the walls. The string snapped. The arrow flew. It struck Richard just below the shoulder. At first, he barely flinched. He laughed again, even as the blood began to seep through his tunic. "A scratch," he said, but the wound was deep, and within days it turned black with infection. The royal surgeons worked by torchlight, their knives shaking, their prayers trembling on their lips. They cut into his flesh, but the rot had already spread. The Lionheart, the man who had survived the deserts of the Holy Land, the prisons of the Empire, the wars of Europe, was dying in a muddy field over a few pieces of gold. As the fever took him, Richard ordered the boy who had shot him to be brought before him. The young man knelt, trembling, expecting torture or death. But Richard, pale and gasping, looked into his eyes and smiled faintly. "Live on," he whispered. "You have killed your king, but I forgive you." It was his final act of mercy, or perhaps of irony. On April 6, 1199, Richard the Lionheart took his last breath. His mother, the great Eleanor of Aquitaine, arrived too late to save him. She cradled his head as the candlelight flickered over the tent walls, and the greatest warrior of Christendom slipped into silence. They buried his heart in Rouen, his entrails at Châlus, and his body at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father. The family forever divided, even in death. The legend of the Lionheart was complete, but the man was gone. He had fought for God, yet died for gold. News of Richard's death struck England like a thunderclap. The The mighty Lionheart, the warrior king, the Crusader, the embodiment of chivalry, was gone. Across Europe, church bells tolled and poets wept, but in the corridors of power, whispers rose louder than prayers. Who would rule now? The answer was a man the world would come to know by another name, John Lackland. The brother who had betrayed him, lied about him, and tried to steal his throne. Now, by blood and by fate, that same brother wore the broken crown of England. At first, the people hoped for peace. Richard's endless wars had drained the treasury and stained the land with taxes. Maybe they thought John would bring stability, but they soon learned that the Lionheart's greed had been glorious. His brothers would be cruel. Where Richard's ambition had been grand, John's was petty. Where Richard inspired loyalty, John demanded it. He raised taxes higher still, not for crusades or castles, but to fill his own vaults. He seized lands, punished nobles, and crushed dissent. Even the church felt his hand, cold, grasping, and faithless. England began to rot from within. The spirit of the Lionheart faded into legend, his golden image used to justify his brother's tyranny. "The king is dead," they whispered in taverns and marketplaces, "and the lion's shadow has become a wolf." Meanwhile, in France, King Philip II smiled. He had waited for this moment. The death of Richard meant the weakening of England's hold on the continent. One by one, Philip began reclaiming the lands the Lionheart had fought so fiercely to defend. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, all began to slip away, and John, cowardly and indecisive, could do little but watch. He lacked his brother's courage, his charisma, his fire. He ruled through fear, not loyalty. Nobles who once followed Richard into battle now plotted rebellion. Even the church turned against him when he defied the Pope, leading to England's excommunication, an entire nation cast out of Christendom. As years passed, the legend of Richard the Lionheart grew brighter the longer he was gone. Bards sang of his bravery, monks recorded his glory. To the people, he became something more than a man, a symbol of lost greatness. His faults were forgotten, his flaws sanctified by time, and every story of his valor was a silent accusation against his brother's failure. By 1215, the kingdom was collapsing. The barons, sick of John's cruelty and broken promises, rose in rebellion. Under pressure, the hated king was forced to sign a document that would change the world forever, the Magna Carta. It limited the power of the monarch and gave rights to the people, though it was born not from idealism, but from desperation. In a cruel twist of fate, the tyranny of one brother would lead to the birth of liberty, and the legacy of the other, the lion who had ruled by sword and faith, would become the ghost that haunted every English king who followed. Richard the Lionheart had fought for God and glory. John Lackland ruled for himself and lost both crown and soul, but between them, they forged the path that would shape nations. One through fire, the other through ruin, and so, the Lionheart's story did not end with his death. It began with what his absence left behind, a kingdom searching for a heart that could never be replaced. Time has a strange way of rewriting men. The longer Richard the Lionheart lay in his tomb, the less he resembled the man who had lived, and the more he became a myth. His sins faded into dust, but his name, his courage, his image burned brighter with every generation. The people who once cursed his taxes now sang his praises. The poets who never saw him fight swore that they had glimpsed his golden banner on the wind. In death, the Lionheart achieved what he could never grasp in life: immortality. To the medieval world, he was the perfect king, the warrior who defied tyrants, the Crusader who faced Saladin, the embodiment of Christian chivalry. They told tales of his strength, that he could split an anvil with a sword. They claimed his roar could scatter armies, but the truth was far more human and far more tragic. Richard had not been a saint. He was proud, impulsive, and often cruel. Yet he became what people needed him to be, a symbol of courage in an age of chaos. In England, his statue rose before palaces and cathedrals. Chroniclers painted him in shining armor, bathed in divine light, but the irony lingered. The king, who had barely spoken English, who had spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign in his own country, became the eternal emblem of English heroism. It was as though the nation had crowned not the man, but the dream he represented. Across the centuries, his legend grew. Ballads spoke of his bravery against Saracens, his mercy to the weak, his defiance before emperors. Minstrels sang his story beside roaring hearths, each verse polishing away the blood and betrayal. The Lionheart became a mirror, reflecting the virtues his people longed for: honor, loyalty, and strength unbroken by fear. Even his rivalry with Saladin took on the shape of myth. The two kings, once enemies divided by faith, were remembered as kindred spirits, noble, just, bound by mutual respect. Chroniclers wrote that when Richard died, Saladin mourned. Whether true or not, it was the story people wanted to believe, that even war could give birth to honor. But not everyone bowed to the legend. Some voices, softer but wiser, whispered of the truth beneath the armor. They remembered the greed, the executions, the broken promises. They asked if Richard had truly fought for God, or only for himself. They saw his crusade not as holy triumph, but as tragedy, proof that faith can burn brightest right before it destroys itself. Still, the myth endured. Centuries later, when England faced new wars and new fears, kings and generals invoked the Lionheart's name. His spirit marched with them, from the battlefields of France to the deserts of empire. To be called lion-hearted became the highest praise a warrior could earn. And yet, beneath the marble statues and gilded manuscripts, the truth of Richard's story still beats, fierce, flawed, and unforgettable. A man who sought God in glory, who found fame in blood, and who died chasing treasure buried in the mud. He was not a perfect king. He was a mirror of mankind itself, capable of greatness, blinded by pride, redeemed by the legends told in his name. 7 centuries after his death, the legend of Richard the Lionheart was still alive, but his body lay silent beneath layers of stone and history. In the quiet halls of Fontevraud Abbey, under the shadow of ancient arches, his tomb rested beside those of his parents, King Henry II and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. The sculpted effigies showed a family at peace, their hands folded in prayer. But beneath the marble calm lay a story of betrayal, ambition, and a dynasty carved apart by pride. In 1838, French archaeologists opened the tomb. They found little but dust, and fragments of a man once worshipped as a god of war. His bones had long decayed, his armor vanished, his crown turned to rust. Yet his heart, buried separately in Rouen Cathedral, still survived, wrapped in linen, sealed in a lead box, and hidden beneath the altar of a city that once called him king. When scientists opened it centuries later, they found something extraordinary. Inside that tiny box was not gold nor jewels, but ashes, mixed with traces of incense, myrtle, mint, and frankincense. The spices of the Holy Land, the same perfumes used to anoint the body of Christ. It was as if those who buried him wanted his heart to smell like sanctity, to mask the scent of blood that had followed him through life. The discovery sparked fascination across Europe. Newspapers called it the heart of a Crusader, the relic of a forgotten age when faith and violence walked hand in hand. But to historians, it was something deeper, a symbol of contradiction. The Lionheart's heart had been preserved with the fragrance of holiness, yet his life had been marked by the stench of war. It was the perfect paradox of medieval kingship, the saint and the sinner sharing the same flesh. Standing before the tomb today, one can almost hear the echoes of that duality. The chants of monks merge with the distant roar of battle, the prayers for mercy with the clang of swords. Richard had died chasing gold, but the world remembered him as a soldier of God. Perhaps that was the greatest irony of all, that his legend redeemed what his life could not. His heart, literally divided from his body, became a metaphor for his soul, half in heaven, half in earth, half burning with divine purpose, half consumed by mortal desire. And maybe that is why his story endures, because it is not just the tale of a king, but of every man who has ever tried to reconcile power with faith, ambition with salvation. As the centuries passed, the dust of the Lionheart became part of Europe's soil. His castles crumbled, his banners faded, but the myth lived on in the hearts of dreamers, warriors, and storytellers. The lion still roared, not from his tomb, but from the memory of those who needed to believe that courage could redeem even the proudest soul. And in the end, perhaps that is what Richard truly fought for, not God, not gold, not even glory, but remembrance, to live on in story when his body could not, to leave behind a roar that history would never silence. More than 8 centuries have passed since Richard the Lionheart rode across the sands of the Holy Land, his sword raised in the name of God. Empires have fallen, kingdoms have changed, and the world he fought to shape has long turned to dust. Yet his name, Richard Coeur de Lion, still echoes, still burns, still divides those who dare to ask one simple question: was he a hero or a warning? History remembers him as the perfect king, tall, fearless, noble, a man who spoke with the voice of thunder and led his soldiers like a god of war. But beneath the crown of legend lies a truth more human, more haunting. Richard was not a man of peace. He was a man of passion. His courage inspired thousands, but his pride destroyed just as many. He fought for God, yet his wars emptied the churches and starved his people. He built castles that touched the sky, yet died chasing gold buried in the mud. In life, he was worshipped. In death, he was sanctified. And in legend, he became eternal. But eternity has its price. The more glorious the myth, the darker the shadow it hides. The Lionheart fought for heaven, but he ruled on earth. And earth is not a holy place. It is a battlefield of greed, ambition, and fear. Richard believed he was chosen, that God's hand guided his sword. Yet the more he fought for the cross, the more his faith became a reflection of himself. He turned God into a mirror and saw not salvation, but his own reflection staring back. Perhaps that is why his story still fascinates us. Because in Richard's rise and fall, we see the endless struggle between faith and pride, purpose and ego, light and shadow. We see what happens when belief becomes obsession, when conviction blinds the heart that carries it. The Lionheart's legacy is not in the lands he conquered or the castles he built. It is in the questions he left behind. What does it mean to fight for God? How much can a man sacrifice before his cause becomes his curse? And when history calls us to greatness, will we choose glory or grace? As we look back across the centuries, past the armor and the banners, past the songs and the myths, we find not a saint, but a man who burned so brightly that even death could not extinguish him. And maybe that is what made him truly lion-hearted. Not his victories, but his hunger, his relentless need to be remembered. In the end, Richard the Lionheart did not die for gold, nor for God alone. He died for something far more human, the desire to be immortal. And in that, perhaps he succeeded. His body lies in dust, but his roar still lives in every story told about courage, ambition, and the price of both. So remember this: history does not belong to the perfect. It belongs to those who dared, those who fell, those whose hearts beat too loudly to be forgotten. Richard was one of them, a king who fought for God, but died for gold. And you, listening to this now, must ask yourself, when your story is told, what will your heart fight for?
If you've journeyed with me through the life of Richard the Lionheart, from his crusades to his tragic death, your next step is simple. Subscribe now so you never miss the next legend we uncover. A comment below. What lesson do you take from Richard's story? Faith, pride, ambition, or something else? Like and share this video so more history lovers discover these forgotten stories.